There's a photograph from 2006 that still circulates on football Twitter every few months. Juan Román Riquelme stands alone in the centre circle at the Olympiastadion in Berlin, hands on hips, watching Germany celebrate a penalty shootout victory over Argentina in the World Cup quarter-final. His socks are rolled down, his shirt is untucked, and his face carries the expression of a man who knows he's just played his last meaningful game for his country. Not because he chose to, but because the game itself had decided it no longer had room for him. He was 38 years old. Sorry, 28. He looked older. The weight does that. Not the weight on his body, Riquelme was never particularly athletic, but the weight of being constantly, relentlessly questioned, of being brilliant and yet somehow never quite enough, of being called a genius by those who watched him and a liability by those who measured him. The question isn't whether Riquelme was world-class. The question is, why did a player of his quality spend his entire career having to prove it? To understand Riquelme, you have to understand what the number 10 shirt meant in Argentina at the turn of the millennium. It wasn't just a position, it was a birthright, a burden, a kind of secular religion. Maradona had worn it. So had Ortega, briefly. The expectation was that every generation would produce another, someone who could dictate tempo, thread impossible passes, and carry the nation's hopes on their back without breaking. Riquelme inherited that shirt in 2001, and for a while it seemed like destiny. He'd already established himself at Boca Juniors as the kind of player who made football look like chess. Slow, deliberate, always 3 moves ahead. He didn't run past defenders, he made them irrelevant. His signature move wasn't a step over or a feint, it was the pause, that half second of stillness before a pass that made opponents commit, made space appear where there was none. Boca won the Copa Libertadores in 2000 and 2001 with Riquelme orchestrating everything. The Bombonera would chant his name like a prayer. Román, Román, Román. It echoed off the stands, deep and rhythmic, the sound of a city in love. But even then, there were doubts. When Barcelona signed him in 2002, the Spanish press called him the new Maradona, which was both a compliment and a curse. He arrived at a club in transition, a team that hadn't won La Liga in 4 years and was still figuring out what it wanted to be. Riquelme played 28 games that season. He was often brilliant. His debut against Sevilla featured a pass so perfectly weighted it seemed to defy physics. But he was also often substituted. Louis van Gaal, Barcelona's manager, preferred a faster, more direct style. He wanted runners, not thinkers. Riquelme wanted time on the ball. Van Gaal wanted the ball moved in 2 touches. The tension was philosophical, not personal, but it felt personal. By the end of the season, Riquelme was gone. Loaned to Villarreal, a mid-table club on Spain's eastern coast that nobody outside Spain had heard of. It should have been a step down. Instead, it became his masterpiece. At Villarreal, Riquelme was untouchable. Between 2003 and 2007, he transformed a modest club into a European force. They reached the Champions League semi-final in 2006, knocking out Rangers, Everton and Inter Milan along the way. Riquelme was named La Liga's best foreign player. Twice. He finished 3rd in the Ballon d'Or, voting in 2005, behind only Ronaldinho and Frank Lampard. The football he played was unhurried, almost arrogant in its calmness. He'd receive the ball 30 yards from goal, surrounded by 3 defenders, and somehow emerge with space and time to pick a pass. His assist for Diego Forlán against Inter, a chipped ball over the defence that landed on Forlán's boot like it had been placed there by hand, was replayed on Spanish television for weeks. Commentators called it El Pase Imposible, the impossible pass. But here's the thing, while Riquelme was thriving in Spain, football was changing. The 2006 World Cup was the last tournament where a traditional playmaker could still be the centrepiece of a team's tactics. After that, the game shifted. Pressing became systematic. Athleticism became non-negotiable. The number 10 position didn't disappear, it evolved into something else. Into Kaká's driving runs, into Sneijder's verticality, into players who could do what Riquelme did but faster, with less time, under more pressure. And Riquelme, for all his brilliance, couldn't adapt. Or wouldn't, depending on who you ask. The moment everything crystallised was that quarter-final in Berlin. Argentina had been one of the favourites going into the tournament. They dismantled Serbia and Montenegro 6-0 in the group stage, with Riquelme pulling the strings. Maxi Rodriguez scored one of the great World Cup goals against Mexico in the round of 16. 8-9. Volleyed finish from Riquelme's cross, and suddenly it felt possible. Redemption for 2002. Vindication for Riquelme. But Jose Pekerman, Argentina's manager, had a decision to make. Germany were younger, faster, more aggressive. They pressed high and transitioned quickly. Riquelme's game required space and time, two things Germany had no intention of giving him. Pekerman started him anyway. For 72 minutes, Riquelme tried. He dropped deep to collect the ball. He drifted wide to find pockets. But every time he touched it, two German players closed him down. Bastian Schweinsteiger and Thorsten Frings took turns shadowing him, never letting him settle. The Olympiastadion was loud, hostile, a wall of noise that made communication nearly impossible. Argentina's attacks became disjointed. Riquelme's passes, usually so precise, started going astray. Not by much, a yard here, a half-second late there, but enough. And then, in the 74th minute, Pekerman substituted him. Not for another playmaker, for Julio Cruz, a striker. The decision was tactical, pragmatic even, but it felt like a verdict. Riquelme walked off slowly, his face blank, and sat on the bench with a towel over his head. He didn't watch the rest of the match. He didn't watch the penalties. When it was over, when Argentina had lost, he stood in the centre circle alone, and the cameras found him. That image, Riquelme isolated, defeated, obsolete, became the story. Not the penalty misses, not Pekerman's tactics, Riquelme. The playmaker who couldn't keep up. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Argentine newspapers ran headlines like El fin de una era and Roman's last dance. Pekerman was criticised for taking him off, but also for starting him in the first place. Riquelme himself said nothing for weeks. When he finally spoke, in an interview with Olé, he was measured but clearly hurt. "I gave everything I had," he said. "If that wasn't enough, then maybe I'm not what they need anymore." The media framed it as a generational shift, the end of the romantic playmaker and the rise of the modern midfielder. But it was more complicated than that. Riquelme returned to Villarreal for one more season, then went back to Boca Juniors in 2007. He spent the next 7 years there, winning titles, adored by fans, but largely forgotten by Europe. He played in the 2010 World Cup, but was a peripheral figure. By 2014, he wasn't even in the squad. Maradona, who managed Argentina, briefly publicly criticised him, saying Riquelme lacked the mentality for the modern game. It was a strange, sad coda. Here was a player who had been compared to Maradona, now being dismissed by him. The narrative had shifted from misunderstood genius to relic of a bygone era. And the thing is, both were true. Riquelme was a genius, and he was a relic, not because he lacked quality, but because football had decided it valued something else more. What's strange is how the story has been remembered. If you ask younger fans about Riquelme, many don't know who he is. If you ask older fans, they'll tell you he was overrated, that he couldn't handle the physicality of modern football, that his best years were spent at Villarreal, which somehow diminishes them. But if you ask the players who played with him, the story changes. Forlan called him the best teammate I ever had. Palermo said, "Playing with Román was like having an extra second to think." Even Messi, who overlapped with Riquelme briefly in the national team, said he learned more from watching him than from any coach. The gap between how Riquelme is remembered and how he should be remembered is vast. He won everything there was to win at club level in South America. He dragged Villarreal to heights they've never reached since. He was one of the best players in the world for a 3-year stretch. And yet, the dominant narrative is one of failure, of a player who couldn't adapt, of a luxury football couldn't afford. The truth is more uncomfortable. Riquelme didn't fail. Football moved on without him, and in doing so, it lost something. Today there's a nostalgia for players like Riquelme. Highlight reels of his passes rack up millions of views. Threads on Twitter debate whether he'd thrive in Guardiola's system or Ancelotti's. The consensus seems to be that modern football, for all its tactical sophistication, has become less beautiful. That the emphasis on pressing and transitions has squeezed out the artists, and maybe that's true. But it's also revisionist. Riquelme wasn't pushed out by some corporate conspiracy or tactical fad. He was pushed out because football became faster, more intense, and more demanding, and he couldn't or wouldn't change. That's not a moral failing, it's just the reality of evolution. The game that made him a star eventually decided it didn't need him anymore. And the tragedy isn't that he failed, it's that being world-class wasn't enough. The real question isn't whether Riquelme would succeed today, it's whether today's football would even allow a player like him to develop in the first place. Whether a teenager with his skill set, slow, technical, reliant on time and space, would be nurtured or discarded. Whether we've built a game that only rewards one kind of brilliance. Riquelme's legacy isn't about what he achieved. It's about what football traded away when it decided he was no longer necessary, and whether, in the end, that trade was worth it. Do you remember watching Riquelme play, or did you only discover him later through highlights and nostalgia? I'd be curious to know.